Hello, I'm doing a movie review, and the movie I want to review is the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Now, this is a remake of the 1974 film of the same name. Now, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre remake came out in 2003. The film was put out by Platinum Dunes, which is a production company created by Michael Bay, and after this they would go on to remake other classic horror films. Like, they ended up putting out the remake of the Amityville Horror, they put out the remake for The Hitcher, they produced the Friday the 13th remake, and they also did the Nightmare on Elm Street remake as well. They also did the Willard remake, which came out around the same time as this movie, and I don't know if the Willard remake came out before or after this movie. Now, the film is directed by Marcus Nispel, who would go on to direct the 2009 remake of Friday the 13th. Now, this film does seem to be a relatively polarizing film for a lot of horror fans. There are some horror fans who really love this movie. Like, I actually know some people who like this movie almost as much as the original film, but then there are other people who absolutely despise this movie. I'm kind of in the middle. Like, I don't hate this movie, but I don't really love it either. I just find the movie to be alright. Now, you might think I love the movie because I actually have a little poster for the movie in the background there. That's mainly because I do have some nostalgia for this movie, because I actually saw this movie when it first came out back in 2003, when I was only 10 years old. My aunt actually took me to go see this in the theaters, and to be fair, I was probably too young to be seeing the movie at that age, but obviously at that age I didn't really give a shit, and of course at that age I really liked it, because when you're 10 years old you pretty much like anything. Now, my main problem with this movie really is the characters. Like, the characters in this movie, they're not like annoying or anything, but for some reason I just really couldn't care that much about these characters, and that's really my main problem with the movie. And also, I was just recently rewatching it, and it was actually really hard for me to actually get into the movie for some reason. But I do think it's a very well-made movie, and once again, I mean, I think it's an alright movie. I definitely don't hate this movie, but I don't really love it either. I'm very much in between on this movie. Now, the plot of the movie is it's set in the year 1973, and it's about a group of young adults who are on their way to Dallas to see a Leonard Skinner concert, and they're driving through this small town, and they come across this girl walking on the side of the road. They pick her up, and it's clear this girl has just been through a very traumatic experience. Like, she's hysterically crying, like she's out of her mind, and she ends up taking out a gun, and the way it's made to look, it almost looks like she pulled the gun out of her vagina. Like, that's the way it's made to look. It's freaking weird, but she pulls out a gun and blows her brains out. So now these young adults, they're trying to report this to the police, so they eventually get in contact with the sheriff of this town, but it turns out the sheriff is completely psychotic, and it turns out he's part of this psychotic family called the Hewitts. And one of the members of the Hewitt family is this man who actually wears a human face for a mask, and of course that character is Leatherface. Now, one thing that I did appreciate about this movie is I appreciated that the movie was not a shot-by-shot remake of the original film. It has the same basic story of the original film. It follows a group of young adults who run into a psychotic psychotic family in the rural areas of Texas. So it has the same basic plot of the original film, but for the most part, it's a much different story. And I did appreciate that because I do think remakes should be different from the original film. Otherwise, there's really no point in seeing the remake when you could just watch the original film. It's one of the reasons why the Psycho remake was such a worthless piece of crap. Like, really, shot-by-shot remakes, I'm not a big fan of, so I appreciated that this film was so different from the original film. Another thing I really liked about this movie was Ermey. In the movie, Ermey plays the psychotic sheriff, and he's freaking awesome in this movie. Like, Ermey's character in this movie is very creepy, but also very funny as well. Like, Ermey's character was a very entertaining character, and he's by far the best thing about this movie. Another thing I thought was kinda cool about the movie is at the beginning of the movie and the end of the movie, you have this, like, police footage that's made to look like real police footage that would have been shot back in 1973, and I actually kind of liked that. I thought that was kind of cool. Now, my problems with the movie really is the characters, once again. I mean, the characters, they're not really annoying, but there was nothing about these characters that really grabbed me or anything like that, and also another problem with the film is, once again, when I was rewatching it, it was kind of hard to get into the movie. I actually find the film to be kind of boring, actually, and also, the film is gorier than the original film was, but the film is nowhere near as creepy or disturbing as the original film. Like, the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre had this... It basically had a sense of realism to it, while this movie really doesn't. Another thing about this movie is the movie's supposed to take place in the year 1973, and aside from having, like, the police footage in the beginning and the end that actually looks like police footage that would have been shot back then, and aside from having the Leonard Skinner song Sweet Home Alabama in the beginning of the movie, there was nothing in this movie that really gave you a feel for the decade that this movie is supposed to take place in. Like, at least the movie The Devil's Rejects, which came out after this, that movie took place in the 1970s, but you also really felt the 1970s in that movie. Like, that movie really did give you a feel for the decade that it was supposed to take place in. And honestly, I know some people might want to crucify me for saying this, but I actually think Rob Zombie would have been great at doing a remake of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Like, I actually think he really could have pulled something like that off, because as it is, House of a Thousand Corpses and The Devil's Rejects were already tributes to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I actually think he really would have done a good job at doing a remake of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Like, I know a lot of people didn't like his remake of Halloween, even though I personally liked that movie. I could get why some people wouldn't like that one, because really Halloween, the whole Halloween mythos really doesn't fit in with Rob Zombie's style of filmmaking, but the whole Texas Chainsaw Massacre mythos, that really does fit in with his style of filmmaking. So I really think he could have pulled off a Texas Chainsaw Massacre remake. So, overall, I have mixed feelings on this movie. I don't love it, but I don't hate it either. I just find the movie to be alright. Now, probably the main reason I'm giving this movie a pass is really because I do have a lot of nostalgia for this movie, because, as I said, I first saw this movie when I was 10 years old, so I do have nostalgia for it, even though I just find the film to be alright. But I definitely recommend checking this movie out and making your own opinion of it. And as I said, some people really love this one, and some people really hate it. So definitely check it out for yourself and make your own opinion of it. Now, one thing I do want to point out is when this movie came out, it was promoted as being inspired by a true story, and to be fair, I think the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie was also promoted as being a true story as well, and it really isn't. It's loosely inspired by the crimes of Wisconsin murderer Ed Gein, but when I say loosely, I mean very, very loosely. But I think when this movie came out, and I was only 10 years old at the time, a lot of kids my age were like, no way, man, it totally happened. Like, at least a lot of younger kids thought that this movie was based on a true case or something, which it wasn't. Once again, it was loosely inspired by the crimes of Ed Gein. And this remake also had a prequel made to it in 2006 called The Texas Chainsaw Massacre: The Beginning, and that's actually going to be my next review. So yeah, that's my review on the remake of The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and bye.